So today, we're going to tackle two of the most monumental events of the 20th century. We're going to explore the controversial connection between them, looking at it all through the lens of our source materials. The absolute tragedy of the Holocaust and the UN's fateful decision to partition Palestine. Let's dive in.
Here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we need to understand the sheer scale of the Holocaust. Then we'll see how the question of Palestine ended up before the United Nations. After that, we'll examine the legal arguments made against partition, as laid out in our source. Fourth, we'll get into the disputed link between these two major issues. And finally, we'll look at the resolution itself and what happened next.
We have to start right here, with this number. It's a figure that's so huge, it's almost impossible to really wrap your head around, but it's absolutely essential to understanding everything that follows. That's the number, the estimated 6 million Jews who are systematically murdered during the Holocaust. This genocide, which is known as Shoah in Hebrew, created a historical and moral reality that would completely reshape world opinion and the entire political landscape after the war. All right, for our first section, let's really try to grasp the scale of this catastrophe, drawing from our historical source.
What's so crucial about this timeline is that it shows this didn't just happen overnight. It was a methodical, terrifying escalation. It started with economic strangulation in 1937, then ramped up to organized violence with Kristallnacht in 1938, and then it became systematic, industrialized mass murder with Operation Barbarossa and the Wannsee Conference. And the name for this plan was the final solution. Let's be really clear about this. As it was discussed at the Wannsee Conference, this was not some kind of vague idea. It was the official Nazi plan for the total extermination of the Jewish people, and it was carried out with a horrifying industrial efficiency. And this table, wow, it really illustrates just how widespread this was. When you look at the numbers from our source, you see that in Poland, which had Europe's largest Jewish community, over 88% were murdered. In Lithuania, it was almost 97%. These numbers show that the huge majority of Jews who were killed weren't from Germany itself, but from all the countries the Nazis invaded. So, in the wake of the war, the world's attention turned to the brand new United Nations. For this next part, we're going to lean on a really detailed legal analysis to understand what happened.
Okay, so the war is over. Great Britain, which had been running Palestine under what was called a mandate, basically says, we're out. They created a political vacuum, and in 1947, they just handed the whole problem over to the UN, asking them to figure out what to do with the territory.
Now, this is a really key piece of the legal puzzle. According to our source, the original agreement from the League of Nations, which set up these mandates, saw places like Palestine as provisionally independent nations. The mandate was only ever supposed to be temporary help, until they could stand alone.
And that brings us right to the core legal arguments that were made against the Partition Plan, as they're detailed in this law review article. This quote from the article's author, Nabil El-Arabi, just hits you right away. It perfectly summarizes the source's whole critique. The argument being made here is that in the rush to find some kind of solution, the UN basically tossed its own rulebook aside for what the author calls political expediency. So what exactly was the case the Arab states were making, according to our source? Well, it rested on the UN's own principles. They argued for independence based on the right of self-determination for the majority population, exactly what had happened in all the other similar mandated territories. But their formal request to even put independence on the agenda, it was shot down. All of this raises a huge question that was just hanging in the air through this entire debate. Did the UN even have the legal power to carve up a country against the wishes of the majority of people who lived there? And according to the source, there was actually a chance to get a real definitive answer. A UN subcommittee literally suggested, hey, let's ask the world's highest court for their opinion on this exact question. But that proposal, it was voted down. So that legal question mark was just left hanging there. Okay, now we're getting to what the law review article argues is the absolute heart of the matter. This controversial link that was made between the Holocaust survivor crisis in Europe and the political future of Palestine. So how on earth did these two completely separate things, a humanitarian disaster in Europe and a political question in the Middle East, how did they get so tangled up together in this UN process?
Well, the article points a finger directly at the mandate given to the UN's Special Committee, or UNSCOP. They were given this broad power to investigate wherever it may deem useful.
And that was interpreted as a green right to go visit the displaced persons camps in Europe. According to the author, by officially including the European refugee crisis in its report on Palestine, the committee fundamentally prejudiced the fate of Palestinian Arabs. And this quote really sums up the article's sharpest criticism. The author's argument is that by connecting the very real, very urgent need for a home for Jewish survivors with the political fate of Palestine, the General Assembly abandoned its own high-minded principles to advance a specific political goal. All right, let's move to our final section, the actual outcome of all these debates and the consequences that are, of course, still with us today. So, after all the intense political maneuvering and debate, the day came. On November 29, 1947, the UN General Assembly voted, and it passed Resolution 181. This resolution recommended splitting the territory of Mandatory Palestine into two states, one Arab and one Jewish. Now, this slide really gets to a major point of contention, showing the breakdown from the law review. At the time, you had the Arab population, which was over 2/3 of the people there, and they were allocated about 42% of the land. On the other side, the Jewish population was under 1/3, and they were granted about 56% of the land. Our source highlights this distribution as a major source of the conflict. And then, not long after, on May 14, 1948, the very day the British mandate officially ended, the State of Israel was declared. And its declaration of independence pointed right back to that UN resolution as a legal foundation, a point our legal source highlights as being pretty controversial since General Assembly resolutions are usually considered recommendations, not binding law. And that leaves us here with this really tough, lingering question. This whole history, as it's laid out in our sources, it just forces us to confront this incredibly complex dilemma. How is the world supposed to balance its profound moral responsibility to address an unthinkable tragedy like the Holocaust against the legal and political rights of a population that is already living in a contested land? It's a question that, as we all know, remains at the very heart of the conflict to this day.